Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar, How to Make the Case for a Better Museum Collections Management System. And better in parentheses is only to indicate that the content we're covering today will be helpful if you don't have a CMS in place and are in need of one, or if you do have a collections management system in place, but it is not a good match for you, or you've outgrown it, or for whichever reason is just not a good fit anymore for your museum. So either case is covered today in our content. Quick introductions. So I am Rachel Woody. If this is your first time attending one of the webinars, I'm the founder and director of Relicura. I have 20 years of experience in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. And in addition to being a business owner and consultant, I'm an author, speaker, and people first advocate. Quick housekeeping items. A link to this recording and links to any of the resources we happen to share throughout will be sent out via email to everyone who registered for the webinar. So if you're attending the premiere, you'll get an email 24 hours from now with all of that information. And this session is pre-recorded. That's so I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you while also being able to answer follow-up questions in the chat. Please feel free to share comments, questions, resources, additional information as we go through. If you're joining us for the premiere, that's why we have the chat box. However, because we're using the YouTube platform, YouTube does require that you have like a Google account or at least a YouTube account in order to use the chat. Speaking of YouTube, we are using the YouTube platform, which means we have the tools that typically come with the YouTube player. You can expand the video, you can change the different quality of the video you're watching depending on the device you have, and it also means you can enable closed captioning. And then just please remember to respect that this content is my intellectual property and subject to copyright. Contents for today, we're going to talk about the role of the museum CMS. We'll talk about how no CMS or a bad CMS is a burden. We'll get into reasons for why you need a better CMS. We'll give examples of what a good CMS can do. And then we're going to put all of that together and review how to make the case for a better CMS. And just a quick asterisk before we hop into the content. We're specifying museums for today's webinar because some of the museum functionality in a collections management system can obviously be different from an archives collections management system. If you are from archives, much of the content is still applicable, especially the advocacy pieces. Just some of the examples in terms of why you may need a different CMS or some of the benefits may be more museum specific than they are archive specific. So, role of the museum CMS. For the role as like a broad overview and to set a bit of the context, especially for our newer professionals, first and foremost, when collections management systems came onto the scene, it was very much technology focused on and only having the capacity to perform collections management type tasks. So very rudimentary in terms of capturing data about the different collection objects, and to some extent perhaps being able to do reports. So first and foremost, when we started getting our collections management systems in forms of databases versus card catalog, it was all about collection management. Now, of course, and is as equally important in our more contemporary time, is that yes, it's about collections management. And in fact, the scope of collections management that is possible within a CMS has broadened considerably. But it's also about collection access. And in terms of importance, that collection access piece is now equally as important, if not perceived as more important, depending on who you ask. in terms of what the value of the CMS, what value it delivers. So when we are putting together our case, especially as people who tend to be the collection stewards who are doing the collections management, we can sometimes, even though we know access is important, our role and our work and our immediate frame of context is management. And so for today's webinar, I think it's especially important just to highlight that even though we know collection access is important, that we need to address that just about as equally as the management piece when we're making the case. And then the expansion on collection work. So again, in the very beginning time of a collections management system database, it didn't really support many of the other work functions. It was about data capture for the object. But now, of course, in our available collections management systems today, the expectation is that there's functionality built in to support collection work, such as accessioning, such as planning and executing exhibitions, outgoing loans, proposing conservation, assessment, and treatment. So many other areas of our work that all does fall under that collections management umbrella. But yet I am listing here separately because of the evolution of the CMS and how that should be considered when we are making our case. So to continue thinking about the role and bringing it from like broader and historical context down to a more detailed level for our purposes, the role of the collections management system is about object provenance, so past ownership, past travels in history, past selling prices, what have you, having the provenance of those items from whenever they originated, ideally, to when they made it to your museum doorstep. Object description. So another like collections management system 101, first and foremost, is usually always about which objects we have in our collection and then the title and descriptions of such. So object description is huge and all of the other related data points that typically go with it. Exhibition planning and history. So the exhibits that we in our museum roles may be planning or executing. Also included in here is any sort of concept of incoming and outgoing loans. And so tracking that, the ability of executing your own exhibitions, but also the recording of the historical exhibitions that maybe were not even in your museum. Then conservation work, and for many collections management systems now, you can do conservation work from suggesting that the item even needs to be assessed in like a condition information sort of workflow, all the way through to proposing an assessment with a conservator, to approving treatment proposal, to executing the conservation particular treatment, and then including all of those documentations, including the like this is how we treated it type report with that object record in your CMS. Also supporting workflows. Some of the more robust collections management systems offer notifications, like trigger activities in terms of like with the condition information one, if somebody's flagged an object, then an email will then automatically be sent to whomever needs to kick off that particular workflow to then request various conservator, whatever your particular workflow looks like. CMS now are able to incorporate a bit of the workflow management that can go with that and the notifications piece, which is important and helpful, especially if you're in a museum that it has at least one other person. We also know, of course, with that access piece facilitates searching, and that's, of course, us as users using our own database, searching and needing to find things in the collections database, as well as, of course, the external users. And then offering online access. So again, as you recall, this was not always a deliverable of a collections management system. And yet now it is the expectation, unless you are at a museum in a minority sense in terms of maybe it's a private collection and there's for legal or ownership or whatever sort of policy reasons that you would not be putting your collections online. So that is now becoming so much an expectation that it is often a minimum requirement when I am working with clients where collections management systems must now have the ability to publish collections online. And we'll get into Past Perfect as an example a little later in our questions, but you can see products like Past Perfect that existed in like a pre-online state and how the evolution has, with many evolutions where there are awkward growth points, where they had Past Perfect 5, and then there was a concept of Past Perfect Web versus Past Perfect Online, one only offering staff the ability to work with a collection on the cloud in a internal sense versus no actually publishing online. Most people who have never realized the difference, like it is obviously confusing when facing it on the surface. And so it's just an example of Past Perfect being a product that has been one of like the foundational products for the field for decades, and seeing its evolution in a imperfect way, which is just an example of like we have all gone through that kind of evolution in terms of how we've adapted our jobs, and in a field that didn't really change for decades. We have gone through tremendous change just in the last decade and a half. Expectation of things online, advances in technology. We're now seeing artificial intelligence be introduced into our work. So it's actually pretty incredible that for a field that's been around for centuries, that we have been faced with so much radical change. Some of it for the better, and some of it is challenging. So apologies for the tangent, but I think hopefully the example of context is helpful. All right, how no CMS or a bad CMS is a burden. So remember, whether or not you have a collections management system in place, these advocacy points can help in terms of advocating for getting any CMS in, hopefully one that is a good fit, or if you have a CMS but it just like is not a good fit. Maybe it was never a good fit, or maybe you've outgrown it. All of these are natural, or at least frequently occurring reasons for museums once they're ready to move to a different product. So the burden broadly is for the collections management system. Yes, it is a database, but also when we're talking about it from our perspective, it's a tool to do our jobs. And so, in the broadest sense, if there are no tools or incorrect tools, then it's difficult to do our job like at all, let alone correctly or according to best practice. And so, I think that's an important distinction, especially for the organizations that may have a CMS, but it's at a point where it is no longer workable, or it is an incredibly difficult and like even adds on to your work. So having the wrong tools, ill-fitting tools, no tools at all, is obviously going to have an impact on the job that you are doing. And to get more specific, of course, for our use cases, part of the burden with either no CMS or like a badly functioning one for you is that any object information that exists is typically very non-centralized, or even if it is in the database, then in a very non-standardized format. That is not intended in terms of like to imply any shame. It's actually a very naturally occurring phenomenon in terms of when human beings use systems and there's the natural like staff transitions and atrophy. Even those who have best practices in place, there's still opportunity. We're humans, we make errors all the time. And so with a bad CMS, that gets exaggerated, especially if it doesn't support standardized data entry. And so there's always going to be some bit of either errors or lack of information or inability to pull up accurate information. Also, object information can't be validated, automatically pulled, nor shared. So if it's a somewhat rudimentary CMS, it may not even have the functionality, or at least not powerful or specific enough to search on all the criteria that you may need to do your searching on. From my context, often when we're deep diving with clients, like there are some very specific criteria in some very obscure areas of an object record or within a database that for various work functions or museum reasons need to be able to be searched on. And for the more rudimentary collections management systems, that's just not possible. There are still CMS products out there where not all the fields are searchable, which in my brain is always a disconnect of like, why is there a field if you can't search it? But that's how they are. So needing to really have finite control over your data and needing to be able to trust that what you are pulling can be validated and that it is correct. Also, only small or simple tasks will be possible and collection activities will be limited. If you have no CMS, obviously you can't do any of it. If you have a CMS, but it's a bad fit, then not being able to execute functionality in a way that it applies to your work at the museum and not being able to get that sort of like workflow support that can be possible, let alone any sort of documentation of like exhibition planning, outgoing loans, things like that. And then tasks will take longer. Collection data runs the risk of being lost or inaccurate, and no automation can be offered to support museum staff. So it's just pain points all over. And as collection stewards, we know where each of those pain points are and exactly how painful they are. We know what some of the workarounds might be. But I think it is important to realize that because of the nature of our work as collection stewards, and when I say collection stewards, like literally anybody who's working with the collection. So archivist, collections registrar, collection specialist, whatever you are a steward. So we know this firsthand. We're living it. Director of the museum, no idea. Can pretty much guarantee no idea unless you are a very small shop and the museum director is actually doing some of this work. Also equally unaware are board of directors if you're an organization where part of the governance and certainly part of the budget making decisions happen at the board level, and also none of our subject matter experts. We're talking curators or any other sort of researchers who may casually search the database or who may even use some of the exhibition planning functionality, but ultimately don't know of nor feel the pain points of the collections management piece, which even though collections access is at least 50% of a collections management system's job, the other 50% is management, and only a very select amount of staff do that type of work. So just to realize that where most of the pain points are, yes, there are some for access, but there are even more for management, but not everybody's going to see that, which is part of the importance of why you need to like record and really spell it out for them. So why you need a CMS if you don't have one, or a better CMS. So broadly, you need a CMS or a better CMS in order to do your job. Like that's the Cliff Notes TLDR of why we're discussing this. You need to be able to do your job well, do your job in a way where it is going to fit more accurately and effectively in your capacity. We need it to support others' areas of work. So curatorial, researchers, conservationists, like depending on how large your museum is and how many other people that interface with you, the collections, and therefore the collections management system. We also need a CMS or a better CMS to better meet the needs of our stakeholders. There's expectations too that we should be aware of, but that is another webinar. And ultimately, like very basically need to meet the needs of the stakeholders because that is part of the reason, if not the entire reason, why we exist, why as a museum we exist. We need to meet legal, public trust, or other responsibilities. So, depending on what type of institution you are, municipal, nonprofit, what have you, there is some sort of responsibility, whether legal or ethically implied, for us to execute collections management work in an accurate way, following best practice, and in a way that is effective and efficient in terms of treating the collection, but also perhaps for financial responsibility. Also, we need a CMS or a better CMS to help us mitigate risk. So, risk can be several different things with collections management, but the big ones are risk against loss, risk against damage, risk against hidden or unknown, unknown in quotes, it was known at some point, type of information. And then to bolster museum content and therefore revenue streams, so museum content being as informal as a social media post, all the way to actual exhibition content, exhibition catalog, which of course have ties to revenue streams, whether directly through bringing in foot traffic through the door to see the exhibit, or indirectly through providing content for that social media posts that raised audience awareness levels that then indirectly lead to eventually foot traffic, donors, what have you. And then to support the museum mission. Ultimately, everything we do as our job should be in support of the museum mission, but especially collections management, which is kind of like half the whole reason that we do the things that we do. So ultimately needs to support museum mission. And that means that this is something that's important that we should make sure we have the right tools for. And then to think about it more specifically, when we are tightly resourced, which it's almost a universal thing that museums are suffering from currently, well, maybe not so currently, each year feels like a new crunch financially, but most of us to some degree, tight resources financially, but also, of course, in terms of staff capacity, there always seems to be increasing amounts of work to do, responsibilities to meet, but not the increasing staff level to meet the increase in demands on our time. And even to the point where there's staff atrophy in terms of like losing headcount, losing number of FTE in a department. And so things we need to do are going up, and yet capacity and even headcount are going down, which is the wrong direction for both of those. And so when you don't have a CMS or have one that is not a great fit for you, like it makes that crisis feeling that more acute. And ultimately exaggerates any other sort of thing that you're trying to do because it's going to take you more time or because it's not actually functionally possible. It just really makes a difficult situation untenable. Then, of course, overworked staff, no extra capacity. We are all, in addition, or because of bullet point number one, burnout. Burnout has existed pre-COVID. It has been exacerbated since the onset of the global pandemic. And there's quite an acute mental health crisis happening in our field. It is somewhat beginning to be addressed by professional organizations, at least in acknowledging it as like a conference topic, but is not being addressed in any sort of systematic way, and ultimately perhaps needs to be addressed at the museum level, which is on museum leadership to do, which in and of itself is a different webinar for a different day. But anyway, we're burnt out is the cliff notes of bullet number two. And prone to make mistakes. At the best of times, humans make mistakes, and then we are burnt out, overworked, don't have the right tools. We are making more mistakes, or perhaps the impact of the mistakes is that much greater. Then the inability to correct known mistakes or outdated information. I know for a fact in living it myself and working with a variety of different museum teams, each and every one of them cares deeply about their job and strives every day to do their best work. But if there is a difficult tool involved, if it's going to take up too much time and attention away from another very competing, like equal priority item, then not correcting some outdated information, like that's going to lose every time compared to other things. So if it's not easy enough to do, then it often isn't prioritized to happen. And that is definitely not a judgment on staff at all. It's an impossible situation. Then increased risk to object care and management. If we don't have information readily available, if we don't have information that is accurate or can be relied upon or updated, if we don't have the ability to actually effectively search and pull in information that we specifically were looking for, then it is of no use to us. And that increases risk level for any sort of object care and management. And then not enough of the right information to make decisions. So part of collections management and why the collections management system as a database is so important is that it is capturing that record of information and updates throughout the life of that object in the museum. And so if we need to make like conservation treatment decisions, if we need to make a decision on whether or not something can go out on like an outgoing loan or be displayed, we can't really make those decisions if we don't have the information available to us, whether that is because it's not been able to be captured or not retrievable. Regardless, though, it's you can't make a decision if you don't have all the information. I mean, I guess you could make a decision, but the confidence level on whether or not that's the right decision would be really low. All right, examples of what a good CMS can do. So depending on how your brain works, sometimes thinking about the challenges piece of it is more effective. But for other brains, sometimes thinking about like what does good look like is more helpful. So we're doing both sides of this for your brains, but also you're eventually going to need to communicate this to someone else, and their brain will not always interpret things the way your brain does. So what can a good CMS do? It can make your job easier, more efficient, more effective, increase your capacity for other areas of work because a good CMS will decrease the amount of work you're currently spending doing the same output of work, but decreasing the amount of time that it takes. It can help you support your colleagues in their areas of work. So better CMS, more easily able to use, especially for curators, if they're able to more easily get into the system, all the better. They'll get to know the collections better. They'll be able to do their exhibition planning better, as an example. Having a good CMS will meet the needs of the stakeholders and go a long way towards meeting the expectations part two. It will help meet legal, public trust, or other responsibilities, especially if part of your work with a collections management system is provenance tracking, rights and usage, things like that that are important to make sure are recorded and communicated. It will bolster museum content and therefore bolster museum revenue streams, which, depending on who you're communicating to, finances are usually very impactful to ultimately the decision being made. So if you can ultimately point to income generating activities supported by the collections management system, all the better. And then supports the museum mission, because if you're able to do your job, because all the things of our job ultimately should support the museum mission, then the same is true for a good collections management system. And then to think more in like more detailed examples, it can highlight items and needs of treatment. So you can do different searches in terms of when was the last time items were treated or assessed, when was the last time objects were on display, how long have they been on display, and conversely, like how long have they been in storage and perhaps not seen by the current community. It can demonstrate, so often objects are being used or retrieved. So using statistics through the dashboard in terms of how long, like how many times has the object gone out on exhibition, how many times has the object record been triggered and pulled up in a search. So being able to have actual numbers and statistics can help prove collection use, whether in that in-person exhibit case or by being accessed online. Records and or records and delivers data from which programming decisions can be made. So whether that is exhibition programming, lectures, what have you, being able to incorporate that as part of the data with the collections management system can be incredibly helpful. Also, of course, as we're recording data and making it available, it can help address legal or ethical questions, which is of increasing importance for the ethical side of this. It can decrease the lost or misplaced objects, especially if you're able to get a really good like barcode and location tracking functionality in your CMS, and you were able to barcode your objects. That can go a long way towards like audits or object inventory. It can support the enjoyment, research, or education. So supporting use of the collection and of course, improving discovery and then the use of objects and data. So discovery being the entryway in terms of when somebody searches something, are they actually discovering things that were as intended based on their search? So discovery being the gateway to the access and use piece. So how to make the case for a better CMS. So putting all of these bits together. Making the case in like a broad outline sense, you're going to need like the following ingredients. You're going to need numbers. So any sort of statistics that you may have, even if it's like an informal tracking on your part. You will need anecdotes, even though it might be one or two examples. They can be incredibly helpful for people whose brains, where like numbers can have meaning, but ultimately it doesn't sway how they feel about things, but the anecdotes can. Having examples, so examples of how it's impacting your work, making it impossible to do your work, making it impossible for somebody else to do their work, examples of where it is really causing harm to staff, to the mission, to the collections. Comparisons are very compelling, especially when they are peer or rival in a hopefully fun and good-natured sense. Rival museums and seeing what other museum tools, like what tools they are using, how effective those tools are, can be very helpful to seeing in making a persuasive case. Having CMS options, depending on who you need to make the case to, and thinking if they're directors, board of directors, basically anybody who's not done collections management, they're going to have very little to no idea of what the collections management system options even are. And even if they do have an idea, it could be very outdated. So having CMS options readily available just to like very quickly show in terms of like there are dozens upon dozens and dozens of options. And so having a few different examples and websites just to like briefly show them will be helpful. Cost information, of course. Some proprietary vendors keep their costs private, and they tend to provide quotes on a very case-by-case basis. Other proprietary software, they're very transparent about their prices, and so you'll at least be able to find pricing structure. Typically for the more budget-friendly to medium-sized collections management systems, those tend to be more transparent in pricing. So you'll at least have a little bit of an idea. And then, of course, what is the request? So why are you talking to them about this? What ultimately is the request that you're making? And that is to get a CMS or a new CMS. So to get into a bit more detail, ultimately this will depend, of course, on what your current situation is, your current role, who you're communicating to, and the examples and use cases that are in your particular situation. But most of you and your situations, these will be somewhat relevant. So, explaining what a collections management system is and its role in the museum, if needed. The majority of the time, it's probably needed, even if the person is like, oh, yeah, CMS. Just give them like a 30-second refresher, and make sure that they understand also like it's collections management, but it's also collections access and like a whole thing. So just make sure they have at least the 30-second version. Also outline what exists currently. Again, they may know in theory that you have a CMS in place or that you don't. Um, and if you do, like they may know the name of it, but they may not know much of what it can do. So being able to share with them what's in place, if anything, and the little bit of what it does. Then demonstrate with numbers and narrative so how like no or bad CMS is impacting ultimately object care and management. Offer examples of what conversely what a good CMS can do and to help alleviate issues. And then highlighting peer museum CMS implementations. And so I suggest if you're sending CMS examples, you can also send like, here's what the Museum of Fine Arts is using, and you can go check out their collection. Because having visual examples and also like that comparison case is so effective. Then, of course, provide budget logistic details that need to be considered. So just like many of these folks that you're communicating with won't really know what the options are, they understandably are not really going to know what the costs are. So having an idea of cost, both the one-time costs for implementation and then the annual ongoing cost. Even if you're doing open source and it's quote unquote free, there's still costs to consider, especially depending on the type of setup and whether you have the technical abilities to do all of it. And then ultimately making that ask. So making the ask for a budget of X amount to get a system of this level for this functionality. And we got a question that tied very nicely into the last little bit of this webinar. So I'm going to answer this question before we do conclusion and the rest of the questions. And that is, what involves a good case for a better CMS and why? And so everything that we talked about will help make a great case foundation, but in terms of what is perhaps most effective is calling out staff time and cost, especially if something is taking you 10 hours longer than it should. That is 10 hours you could get back. It's also 10 hours that have a price tag. Even though you are staff, there's still a dollar impact to the museum, which we don't tend to think about if we're traditionally employed, but the museum definitely thinks about in terms of budget. We need to think about and speak to impact on reputation. If your catalog is, well, doesn't exist online, or it does and it's incredibly difficult to search, impossible to search, if it looks outdated, because there are still some really outdated user interfaces that just do not encourage anyone spending much time in, that is going to impact ultimately the museum's reputation. It will also mean falling behind peers, especially if what the peer museums have are nice and shiny, easy to use, getting the attention of donors and granting agencies. Then you are definitely losing out on some of like the intangible like star power there. Also, inability to perform core functions, especially if you're able to tie it to like this should obviously be happening and is required and we are not able to do it. Those kind of shock type things are incredibly important to make sure you include. And then that education piece on what the options are and what the cost is, because usually much of the blockers for the ultimate decision makers is that they just don't have enough of the information to know. And so it's easier for them to say no or to make up the information what they think is a cost or what have you. And so you need to give them some actual numbers to work with, so that they have that information and it's not like the automatic no. And speaking of blockers, it's going to depend on who you are communicating to. but seeking to understand proactively and perhaps before you make the formal pitch what the concerns or like preconceptions are that those people have so that you can proactively address those, and hopefully move a little faster and moving forward a little faster in this quest. So that concludes the formal part of the chat. Before we hop into resources, I'll go ahead and finish up the question slides. As we go through the question slides, of course, if you have follow-up questions, questions of your own, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll answer those as we go, and then we will conclude the webinar. Question: how do you get funding for a better CMS? It feels like there's a big price jump from past perfect, what my institution currently has, to anything better. Are there collections management systems that fall in between that I'm missing while looking into systems? Yes, can definitely empathize, especially, and as we'd mentioned earlier, Past Perfect has been around for quite a while. And so it can often feel, especially during this CMS evolution, like it's a big jump. So in terms of looking for more like modest to medium sized, it will depend on your needs in terms of requirements, functionality, that kind of thing. But there are several different layers of pricing and products. And so ultimately, I am optimistic that you'd be able to find something that meets the majority, if not all, your needs, but also is affordable. Some of the top affordable ones that come to mind, these are by no means the only ones out there, but to at least get you started, quite a few clients and even non-clients, but just being in the professional community, many museums that have used Past Perfect, a majority of them have moved to catalog it specifically. Catalog it, to their credit, developed early on a tool to extract things from Past Perfect pretty seamlessly, and ingesting it into their own system. And because they spent well invested time in creating that tool, I believe that it is free in terms of the migration of data, which migration of data can be a very expensive part of moving from one CMS to another. So Catalog It has made it affordable in quite a few different ways. Collector Systems is another one. They are also transparent about their pricing. It's scalable, so of course, depending on the number of, I think, licenses, sometimes it can be about size of collection, a couple different factors in terms of what the price will ultimately be for your museum. And then Lucidia's Argus tool, Argus specifically for museums. Lucidia, of course, has a whole suite of tools for adjacent professions. They are not necessarily transparent on their website, but they are one of the more open, in conversation vendors that I have worked with. And they do, just based on past experience with clients, they do tend to scope the product to meet the size of the institution, and the cost typically reflects that. So while you wouldn't be able to find it on the website per se, I can speak from experience, or at least knowledge that I have, that they tend to be affordable, or at least in like equity with how big your collection is. Question: what does a CMS look like at a non-museum organization? Is it essentially the same? So I'm assuming non-museum, but still has a collection. So like maybe it's a sports team that's been around for 50 plus years, and so they have a collection, but aren't a museum. So I'm assuming that's the case. If it's not, please let me know and I'll answer it differently. But basically the same, at least with the clients that I have worked with who have not been traditional museums. They're looking at the same type of museum products. However, I do see some variation in, depending on the needs and the collection, If it's not a traditional museum collections management system, then they are going towards a digital asset management system. Sometimes that is flavored differently for like a more marketing context, and so it's asset management, but not necessarily in like a museum or archive sense, but in like a content management sense. Doing the same type of job, just a different way of doing it, different verbiage, but ultimately sort of same needs, same output. So if it's not a collections management system, then I may see a digital asset management system in that place. But of course, much like museums, it depends on what your needs are, depends on your budget, things like that. Question: what are the key tools for a good CMS? So first and foremost, easy to use, intuitive backend. Not only does this help get staff on board for using it quickly, which is so important, it also needs to be able to cut down on time of like, you need to do something, you're not quite sure how to do it, but you'll be able to figure it out in 5 minutes. Also, I love collections management systems that support or reinforce good cataloging. So clicking into a field and having like a pop-up where it tells you exactly what type of data and what format that data should go in, or has like a little, like you can click on a little icon so you can see more about like the actual best practice for a particular field. Having templates set up where, depending on the part of the collection you're cataloging, it comes with displaying the fields that you should be using, all the way to vocab control. Like all of those are so important for ultimately the access of the collection. So having a system support and encourage best practice makes it easier for everyone. Bulk upload and editing, oh my gosh. Because our data, for so many reasons, often needs cleanup, having tools that support that cleanup is critical. If they exist, cleanup will happen. If they do not exist, cleanup will not happen. Sometimes, but very, very seldom does it happen because it can be so painful and so large. Then ability to relate objects to each other. So being able to interlink relationships, whether that is because it was part of the same purchase, whether it shares an era, like number of ways you could do linked data, but having the ability to do that and present it. And then a discovery forward user interface. So encouraging, especially more like general users, the ability to browse within a collection, the ability to deep dive into a collection without necessarily knowing all the museum language around it. It needs to have several points and pathways to discovery of your collection, versus just being like a search box that requires library and level type searching. Having that be able to do is critical, especially if you want the collection to be used. Question: what technology leaders are in this space? So this is a hard one to answer, partly because I try and remain very agnostic on collections management systems, because ultimately, as I have said in this webinar a few times, it just depends on the collection and the needs. So there's never just like one, two, or three of where it's like always recommend, because there's not like a always or typical case. That said, there are some vendors that are doing a much better job than others in terms of modernizing. And I would love to see them move from modernizing to experimenting with the latest in technology. The museum field in general tends to be very conservative in terms of its experimentation, at least within a database sense. And so I'm seeing functionality in like content management systems and even digital asset management systems that aren't necessarily from our field, but they're from like marketing and communications. And they're integrating generative AI and AI in a few different areas in terms of predictive behavior, data modeling, interpreting images and creating descriptive text, assigning keywords, face recognition, if you have photo archives. So I am seeing much better leadership in not our field, unfortunately. Not surprising, but also a little disappointing. So, in terms of like, is there a product where I'm like, they're on top of it? There's not one that gets the gold star from me today. But I do encourage you, if you've not really explored our realm of collections management systems, do some due diligence in that exploration, because you will be able to very easily see, even just visually, who has modernized and who has not. And the way it looks, even though you don't want to necessarily judge a book by its cover, ultimately that will give you a clue as to the underlying infrastructure, the intuitive and ease of use that may or may not exist. All right, resources. Money. So because collections management systems typically cost money, at least in some form, even for open source, I have a grant writing foundational book that you can get a free e-copy of, courtesy of Lucidia Press. And Lucidia and I partnered further, and we created there's a grant directory, but also a grant workbook and templates. If you are new to grants or don't feel as confident as you would like in terms of putting together an application, definitely pick up the workbook. It is also free, courtesy of Lucidia Press. And of the 4 templates, one of them is about a collections management system, and then there's a second one about digital products. So very applicable to today's topic. And then final e-resource, if you are looking for a new collections management system, but you've not gone through like the procurement process before, this book walks through like beginning to end in terms of like the different stages, the different things to think about, putting together specifications, assembling a team, all of that. So if you've never done it before, this book lays it all out in terms of where to begin and how to get there. So again, courtesy of Lucidia Press, you can get a free e-copy of that. And then there's some webinars depending on where you're at in your CMS journey. I have a webinar, CMS 101, Searching, Procuring, Implementing, that is available, related, open to open source, because for many museums, for a variety of reasons, open source may be a good choice for you. And so this will go through things to think about and potential options. And then digital collection essentials. And the subtag for this is what's essential, what's hackable, and what does it cost? For some museums and cultural heritage organizations, it may make sense, or it may not make sense to get the full-blown CMS, and maybe there's a different or at least interim tool while you wait for helping you manage the collections. So this gets a bit creative in terms of, if you can't get the one thing now, or if it doesn't make sense for you to get, maybe there's a different thing that could help meet whichever need you're seeking to try and implement. And that's it. So keep in touch. We'll be wrapping up this year's webinars over these next couple of months, and I am currently in brainstorming phase for content for next year, and potentially reformatting how we do webinars. So that's all to say, if you are somewhat of a regular, or even if you're not, if you have content you'd love to see, if you have like, there's a webinar, but you'd love an update on it, any sort of feedback in terms of what would be helpful for you, I am very open to. Otherwise, I will pick topics I am interested in, but ultimately these are to be of service to you. So if you have something you'd like to see, please let us know. We'll be happy to incorporate it. And then just thank you so much for attending. Best of luck on making the case for a new or better CMS.